Hello, class. I don't have a PowerPoint presentation today, and in fact, this final video in the course is going to be a bit shorter. I'm sorry, I know you're very disappointed with that. But I just wanted to talk through a little bit. This is a bit of a miscellaneous section here at the end, including a few concepts that I wanted to be sure to include. I wasn't entirely sure where to put them in, but I think gives us some helpful things to think about, sort of in kind of wrapping up our conversations about environment society through the course. So let's just chat, and I'm going to unpack just a little bit of the things that you read today and give you a chance just to reflect on them one more time. So in the book, so starting with the readings from the text, the author had some real criticism to put forward on this idea of neoliberalism. It's a term that you may have heard before, might not be familiar with. Essentially, think of it, you may have heard of the concept of laissez-faire economics from high school economics or government class. It's sort of the same thing. The idea of championing a neoliberal political philosophy will champion free enterprise is the primary focus of that. Unregulated markets, focus on privatizing whatever things can be privatized, limited government engagement, deregulation, unregulated markets. These kinds of things are focuses of neoliberalism. And that would be an accurate way to describe much of the dominant sort of philosophy, political philosophy in societies like the United States today. There's a strong focus on that broadly. And I think it's pretty fair to characterize a lot of the American political system is founded upon these kinds of ideas. Of course, Carol Ann points out that we in fact do need market constraints, that their pure neoliberalism doesn't work in society's best interest overall, because it's not sufficient for dealing with things like open access resources, tragedy of the commons. It's not sufficient for dealing with externalities. And so we need market constraints in order to prevent abuse of the commons, for example. We know that the market alone, acting on its own, can't adequately address a tragedy of the commons scenario or economic externalities. And so we have to have some form of regulation in place or some sort of price correction in place in order to account for that. Because if we don't, the alternative is that we end up with abuse of the natural resources around us in a way that ultimately leads to destruction of vital habitats and ecosystems and services, and particularly, and more as we see more people consuming more stuff, that these impacts are becoming significant and threatening the planetary boundaries that hold our planetary system in place and provide the backdrop for where we live and all the things that we need and use. So Carol Ann's critique of neoliberalism here is simply that the market does need constraints, and that, and we've talked extensively about that in this class of what some of those constraints can look like. And then he goes on to sort of put it in this different context of redefining what freedom means. So whereas neoliberalism would say that the goal is to be free from government interference, free from tyranny, free from that kind of interference or regulation. And Carol Ann suggests that perhaps that is too limited of a concept. If we're just being free from something, he refers to that as a negative freedom, the absence of interference. He suggests that freedom needs to also be a positive freedom, freedom to do something, freedom to thrive, to succeed, to eat, to get an education, and that simply preventing interference, freedom from interference, works well for the privileged, works well for people with political power, works well for those who already have. But for most people, that's not necessarily, it exacerbates economic inequalities, which of course is what we see today for the past many decades, that economic inequality has continued to increase. And Carol Ann is suggesting that we need to look at freedom more broadly, that it's not just good enough to suggest that we should have free enterprise, but we need to make sure that people are freed to succeed in life. and that means that we need some sort of constraints that exist. So that's an interesting way, I think, of looking at this, and provides sort of a way of kind of pulling together some of the concepts that we've talked about here. He also posed out this question of, is there a right level of inequality? Which is a really interesting concept, because as the author notes, some level of inequality generally is agreed to be good for society. Societies that have attempted to eliminate all inequality have not worked. That's essentially communism. Though even in communism, like the book 1984, George Orwell's 1984, what's the line that the pigs say? I don't know if you read this, but all animals are equal, but some are more equal than others. Right? So even in communist societies, for example, not everybody was actually equal. There were still always some that were privileged above. So those equal societies don't work. Some level of inequality is good. It rewards those who work harder, those who can contribute significant accomplishments to society. And this is good because it creates incentive for people to do so. So what's the right level of inequality, though? If we don't want everyone to be equal, but we don't want, like is the case today, where CEOs of large corporations make many thousands of times more than what the average employee makes at their corporation, that seems to be not very fair as well. And greatly increased inequality has stifled the ability of the vast majority of people, the middle class, to thrive in society. So what's the right level? He suggests a factor of 10, which I find, I've never heard this concept before prepping for this class and reading. This idea of a factor of 10 as an inequality ceiling, he refers to it as, and uses the example of universities or the military as places where the very top people usually don't make more than 10 times what the very lowest people make. So the general in charge of the Pentagon makes 10 times as much as the private in the military. So that's an interesting concept, I think, as well. And in terms of environmental issues, I think where that plays in too is this idea that the greater the level of inequality, then the more waste we have in society and the more consumption that we have on the high end rather than on more equally distributed across society in a way that is equitable and reasonable. I also like this concept he brings up of rethinking how much we work. So he brings up the economist John Maynard Keynes, who was a very influential 20th century economist, who predicted that we wouldn't work very much by the 21st century because it wouldn't be necessary. We'd have all the things of the technology in place, and certainly we do. We have the technology in place that doesn't require us to work a whole lot. And he assumed that we would choose leisure over making more money when we clearly, all of us in the United States have enough. Most of us, nearly all of us at least, have enough to succeed, to meet our basic human needs, and beyond our basic human needs to basic levels of happiness in life. So this idea of well, what if we just worked less and made less money and spent less money on that way? It's very counterintuitive, but if we work less, then everyone can work, for one. If we work less, there's less overall consumption, which helps address that perpetual problem we've talked about all semester long of how consumption drives environmental degradation. What if we just were content with having less, consuming less, and focusing and investing in the communities where we live? He takes their example, Kellogg's 6-hour workday during the Great Depression, how they implemented that to save money, but they found that their employees were actually happier working less that way. And that's a fascinating concept. That can we be happier working less and having more leisure time, free time, and using that not to invest in buying more stuff, but to invest in our families and our communities and our friendships and our activities around where we live, etc. So interesting concepts there. And his suggestions for a steady economy, because a continued economic growth, as we've talked about, is not beneficial from a planetary perspective. It's very harmful. So he makes a few suggestions: shifting taxes from income to pollution. What an interesting concept, this idea that the bulk of our taxes in our country come from income tax, yet labor is something we desire. So why are we taxing something that is a good thing for society rather than taxing something that is bad, like pollution? What if we eliminated the income tax and instead had a pollution tax that raised the government the equivalent amount of money, but instead of taxing people for their labor, we tax corporations for how much they pollute? That is a fascinating concept. And I think there would be a lot of really interesting ways that influence society in a big way. It would drive down consumption. It would force corporations, not force them, it would incentivize them, strongly incentivize them to decrease their pollution. Using a market-based method, by the way, that if you're taxing pollution, then there's economic incentive to make things cleaner. So it would really push society toward that. I think you would get not nearly as much complaints about that either. If you implemented a large pollution tax, well, nobody likes that idea until all of a sudden you're looking like, oh, we're eliminating the income tax and instead shifting it to a pollution tax. I have no idea if that would work. He only gives it a couple lines. I wish he had devoted more time to that because this also is a new concept for me, and I'd like to look this up more. I mean, it's similar to what we talked about with the carbon tax. Very similar in concept, though on a scale, he suggested on a scale that I hadn't heard of before. So that would be really interesting to look at. Decreasing access to credit, another interesting idea. Think of how much of our consumption is driven by easy access to credit. In other words, put it on your credit card, rack up credit card debt so that you can get your stuff now. Well, that's problematic from a fiscal responsibility perspective, from financial health perspective, from all kinds of things. And we hear that over and over, careful with how you spend, don't get into debt. But think about the environmental implications of that easy access to credit drives consumption in a big way. What if as a society, we focused on decreasing access to credit, make it harder for people to get credit? They are still going to be able to access what they need, right? It would just push us to make wiser decisions, less frivolous expenditures, more fiscal responsibility, and decreased environmental impact because we wouldn't be consuming as much of things that aren't necessary for society. Think of it this way. If you could choose to get a 10% increase in income or to get an extra month off per year, which would you choose? I think almost everyone I know would pick the extra month off per year over the 10% increase in income, which is a very interesting idea of, it points to our priorities that we really want that more time, that more flexibility. And yet our society pushes us towards that making more money thing. It's really interesting. He's just rethinking leisure and recreation, making communities more desirable, less focused on travel and going and buying, more focused on investing in where you are, using different measures of progress rather than GDP, use Human Development Index or the Happy Planet Index or something like that. These are all helpful suggestions for rethinking the way we do society in a way that's more healthy and sustainable in the long run. So your first question, sorry, I do have 3 questions, although I don't have a slide for them. So question number 1, so write this down, pull up a Word document, be ready for this. Okay, which of these economic ideas that we just talked about and that you read about in the Carolan book, which of these economic ideas is most interesting to you? So go ahead and pause this video and write down a quick thought on that. Okay, let's talk about Aldo Leopold. Long reading, huh? I love that one. Honestly, I think that this page, this single page by Aldo Leopold is one of the most, what's the way I'm trying to put this? For me, it inspires the most thought per, length of anything that I think that I read. It's a simple one page, just a couple of paragraphs, and yet it inspires such significant thought because it's such a fascinating concept there that we are part of a community. So he starts off, he acknowledges humans are part of a community. Obviously, we don't exist in isolation. We exist around other people, whether it's our neighborhood we live in, our church, our employer, the school we go to. or just the people around us as we go throughout our day. We're part of a community of human society. He notes that our instincts prompt us to competition. We're prompted to compete by this sort of instinctual process in us, whether it's competing to get the next raise, competing to get a job, competing for the hotter boyfriend or girlfriend, competing to succeed economically, whatever. The competition is built into our nature, but our ethics prompt us to cooperate. So it takes the ethical approach to cooperate. We cooperate because we know that ethically this is the right thing to do. Investing in relationships rather than simply besting people around us. Cooperating to help each other study out of a desire to have friendships and out of a recognition that that's important and a value. Cooperating by being kind to one another. These are the kinds of things that our ethics prompt us to do, even though our instincts are to compete against each other. He then takes this idea of a land ethic. So he takes this concept and he broadens our community so that our community is not just the humans around us, as we have tended to think, but our community includes all of the natural world around us, which is entirely consistent with how we've talked about in this course, our interdependency with a living planet. So we know that we are interdependent on all these planetary systems, these ecosystems that are around the world. The planetary Earth systems, atmosphere and biosphere, all these things work together. We as humans, God placed us on the planet to live in a system that we were dependent on. So we know that that community exists, this ecological community that we're part of. We're not just part of a human community, we're part of an ecological community as well. So what Leopold says is just like within our human community, our instinct is to compete, but our ethics prompt us to cooperate. Our instinct in the ecological community around us, the land around us, prompt us to compete against that. And when we see that played out in so many ways, right? Extraction, pollution, our overconsumption of natural resources, are driving species to extinction, are taking advantage of the commons, outsourcing harmful environmental impacts to other places in the world, borrowing from future generations, overreaching, over-extracting, over-exploiting. This is our instinct, and we're doing that really well. So right now, while human society has developed to a mature place to some extent, interrelationally with one another as fellow humans, right? So wars and conflicts far less common than they used to be in the world. We don't just, because we want something, hit someone over the head with a club and take it from them. This doesn't happen in isolated incidents, of course, but for the most part, we have developed society in a place where our ethics have really guided and shaped our behavior with one another. But we have not done that with the natural world around us. This competition instinct still drives and dominates our actions today. What Leopold is saying is that our ethics should compel us to act differently with the land around us. They should compel us to cooperate. And what might that look like? A right to continue to exist is simply acknowledging that the natural world has a right to continue to exist in the way that it does, that species have a right to exist, that we should, at least in places, preserve parts of the natural world in the way that they are, because it has a right to exist in that way. This idea of mutual flourishing, respect for the natural world, something that has largely been lost or relegated to what those hippies like to believe in, or what the privileged wealthy are able to do because they have leisure. No, our ethics as a human species should prompt us to work together in community with the world around us. Is exactly what Leopold is saying, because just like with our fellow humans, we exist in community with the environment around us, and our mutual flourishing, both for us and for the rest of the natural world, relies upon us doing that. So we're shifting from conqueror to member is the suggestion that Leopold makes. Fascinating concept, easy to understand, makes logical sense, but yet we don't tend to think of that. But I do think that this can shape the way that we think about these broader issues of human use of natural resources. So question number 2, write this one down. What do you think of Leopold's land ethic? What stands out to you? What are your thoughts on this? What do you think of his land ethic? Okay, last one. Pope Francis. I'm not sure if you've seen much about Laudato Si before. The current Pope, Pope Francis, published this in 2015. And it was, this is something called an encyclical, which is a fairly rare thing for popes to publish and has very strong weight theologically within the Roman Catholic Church. So an encyclical, obviously not on par with scripture, but it is theologically much stronger than regular doctrine that's put out within the Catholic Church. This is considered something that is of very high theological significance, an encyclical in the Catholic Church. So they don't come out very often. So this is Pope Francis's encyclical on the environment and on social welfare. And it is a brilliant treatise. And you saw just a little bit of it here. But I love to put this together with Leopold's land ethic because you see so much of this same thing echoed here. So he echoes Leopold's community right there in the first paragraph of the reading. We're talking about how we're linked with God's creation and belong to him along with the rest of creation. So this community kind of approach, that there's a linkage between humans and God's creation, that God's creation belongs to God, that it is his. It's not absent of ownership, that God owns it. And just like we belong to God, that God's creation belongs to God. So there's this community aspect that's set up right from the very beginning. And then he goes on to say, this is not to deprive human beings of their unique worth or responsibility. So acknowledging that, some would say we're all equal, right? So that would be an ecocentric perspective, that humans, animals, plants, all equal, there's no unique value. Well, of course, theologically, we don't ascribe to that. This reminds me of Francis Schaeffer, a different Francis Schaeffer, 20th century theologian, wrote a book called Pollution and the Death of Man in the 1970s, one of the earliest Christian environmental books. And what he writes in there, he addresses this point, the idea of the imago Dei, that humans are made in the image of God. And he acknowledges that humans are different from the rest of creation, and that we are uniquely made in the image of God, right? This is part of our theology. This is a key thing that we understand, that the humans have a unique worth and a unique responsibility. Because we're made in the image of God, we have a unique responsibility to steward in the way that God stewards, to act in the way that honors God. At the same time that we have a unique role, and so in the same way that, yes, we are above the rest of creation because we're made in God's image, but we're also equal to the rest, at the same time, equal to the rest of creation because we are part of God's creation. So humans, compared to God, are equal with the rest of creation because we are a created being. We are part of God's creation. We belong to him. The rest of creation is our brother and sister because we equally were created. Yet we have a unique role in that. So I find that to be an interesting, Pope Francis echoes it here. Francis Schaeffer talks about it. This idea that yes, we have unique worth, but that unique worth pushes us to see ourselves on the same par with the rest of God's creation because we exist in community with it. Pope Francis goes on to say that deep communion with nature can't be real if we aren't concerned with our fellow human beings. So it doesn't matter how ecologically minded you are. If you're not concerned with fellow human beings, then you're a hypocrite and you're not going to be effective in that work. Likewise, disregard for the natural world inevitably leads to disregard for human welfare, he writes. So he makes this point, which I think is fantastic, that if you're going to be concerned with the natural world and environmental issues, you have to be concerned with human beings. And if you are deeply concerned with the value of human beings, you have to be concerned with the natural world because we're linked in a community and we're part of God's creation. And God designed the world to symbiotically work together. To humans and the natural environment to work together is the way that God designed it. And so we have to be equally concerned about these. He warned of an extreme anthropocentrism focus on humans at the exclusion of nature, talks about how that degrades the value of humans themselves in extreme anthropocentrism because it's so self-centered. It degrades the value of other humans. It ignores the God-designed relationship of his creation, and it rebels against God's plan for us to act as human stewards. So we have to acknowledge our unique role and importance, but that also needs to mean that we have a proper role participating with God in the work of creation. Altogether, if you were to wrap up what the Pope's saying here, it's emphasizing the unity of social and ecological concerns. And that's really what his encyclical is all about, is that social and ecological concerns are integrally linked, and that care and concern for the value of human life must equal care and concern of the value of the natural world. Those two are tied together, and that we can't have one without the other, and that they're integrally linked. And of course, as we talked about extensively in this course, degradation of one leads to degradation of the other. Fascinating concept. I really like this here, especially when put together with Leopold's land ethic. Okay, last question. How does the Pope's message here connect to other concepts in this course that we've talked about? So, talking about the Pope, his message here about how the natural world, concern for human are linked in together. Social and ecological concerns have to be addressed together. How does this message from the Pope connect with other concepts we talked about? Okay, that's it. This is the last lecture. I know this one is a little bit different. This was less giving content to you, more of just sort of sharing some broad thoughts. Maybe you found that interesting, maybe not. Anyways, I hope that you've been able to gain a lot from this course. I really enjoy teaching this course, and my only regret is that the online forum doesn't lend itself very well to getting to know students. So I wish I could have gotten to know you a little bit more. At least we get a little bit of that with the Flipgrid posts. But feel free to reach out if you have any questions, if you want to stay in touch. I do teach a course in the spring online called God, Country, and Climate Change, where we dig a lot more deeply into the climate crisis and look at that from a perspective of how faith and politics and sociology all wrap together around the issue of climate change and climate justice. And that's a very interesting one in particular because I bring in some real high-level guest speakers for that course. So if you want to learn from some of the top experts in the world on these kinds of topics, then that's a great course to look at. Okay, I'm going to wrap it up there. Thank you, everybody, and God bless you.